we don't have any anti-competitive practices in the beef sector, according to our competition authority. We've never been found to have any anti-competitive practices in the beef sector. Nevertheless, year in, year out, all the meat plants, and they're controlled by four. There are four major firms involved in them, one very big one, and two slightly smaller ones. But they control the Irish beef sector, and the Irish beef sector is obviously hugely important to Irish agriculture. And year in, year out, prices rise and fall in unison. There's never more than a cent or two in the difference between them. Farmers have long complained of anti-competitive practice in that regard. None has ever been found. In fact, I wasted my time calling for an investigation into the beef sector when I was previously a TD. I think there's a degree to which the Competition Authority have demonstrated, I think, a lack of awareness of how the sector operates. Because, Deputy Bruton talked about the capability to introduce sanctions for the abuse of personal data. But in the beef sector, the processors have all of the data because they know how many cattle are in Ireland right now. They know how many cattle aged 21 months are in Ireland, 28 months, 29 months, 30 months, 34 months. So they can set their price accordingly, knowing that. That's not necessarily anti-competitive because that information is freely available, or at least is available from the Department of Agriculture. But its effect is to stifle competition in the sector because prices are going to rise in tandem and they're going to fall in tandem because they know exactly how many cattle are available. They were facilitated by the BSE crisis some years ago in bringing in this so-called 30-month rule so that people are rewarded for getting rid of their cattle at 30 months. But in fact, it really operates as a penalty. You're penalised if you don't kill cattle at 30 months. So if you know how many cattle are aged 28 months in the country at any given time, and you know how many cattle are aged 29 months, and you know that live exports aren't happening for a variety of reasons. I appreciate there are animal rights arguments against live exports. I think some of those arguments are slightly exaggerated, and they're exaggerated for commercial benefit, and the commercial benefit accrues to the beef processors, because if you ensure that cattle can only leave Ireland one way and that's dead, well then they have to be killed in Ireland. So if they know how many cattle are at a particular age, well then they just set the price. It's very simple. Now, anybody who's anything to do with the beef sector will know that phone calls are regularly made, and there's a fear among the smaller operators of the bigger operators. There aren't that many of them, but there's still a fear factor because ABP is a huge operator. It could wipe you out overnight. In the same way that Cement Roadstone Holdings, CRH, can wipe you out if you're in the quarry business, and have wiped out people in the quarry business. We have to acknowledge realities in this house. So there's that particular factor. Nobody's going to investigate that or what we can do about it. But it's going to be made worse by a couple of new steps because, I should say that the small abattoirs around the country, I grew up in a village like yourself, Minister, and there were 2 butchers in the village when I was growing up. It's not all that long ago. I might look old, but I'm 47. So up to about 25 years ago, there were 2 butchers in the village I grew up in, of Scariff, and both of them were able to kill cattle or pigs, or they didn't kill horses for feed, unlike ABP, but they did kill cattle, they did kill sheep, they did kill pigs. And state policy and Department of Agriculture policy was slowly to wipe out those abattoirs, get rid of them. They're a nuisance. We couldn't be dealing with these small producers any more than we want to be dealing with these small cheese producers. They're just a nuisance. The production of cheese in farmhouses across Ireland is inherently dangerous because cheese is made by bacteria. So we'll sacrifice them. And I had a meeting once with the Department of Agriculture in Limerick. Now, they didn't say it. I could never accuse them of saying it. But I got the distinct impression the people I represented were small cheese producers where there had been a listeria outbreak. They were effectively, the department were taking that opportunity to drive them under, to get rid of them. Because there is a policy, and it mightn't be stated to you or to me, but it is stated amongst people who work in the business, of abolishing the small. I'm glad that Minister Smith is here, because the Green Party do have a policy of promoting small food producers, craft producers, farmhouse producers, and it's hugely important that that happens. But what actually happens on the ground and what's actually promoted by the Department of Agriculture is entirely different. It's to wipe them out, it's to regard them as a nuisance, because if there's a listeria outbreak in a farmhouse producing cheese somewhere, the Department of Agriculture will say, perhaps rightly, that it could threaten our infant milk exports to China. And why would you take that risk for the sake of these small producers who are producing a product that a couple of hundred people love, when we need to protect this huge market to China? But if you go down far enough that road, then you end up with just one person producing a product. And that's where we're heading in the beef sector, by wiping out the small abattoirs. And actually, the number of regional vets employed, my understanding is they're paid for by central government but employed by local councils. But there are less and less and less of those positions available. And as those positions aren't available anymore, well, then you can't have an abattoir. You can't have an abattoir without a vet who's there, or at least can occasionally inspect. So we're really, year on year on year, we're reducing the number of places that cattle or sheep or pigs can be killed in Ireland. And we're concentrating that in the hands of a small number of people. But that's not anti-competitive. That's fine. That's just business. But it's a business model which has the same result as anti-competitive practices. You have small producers being driven to the wall. You have large multinationals making more and more and more money, to the extent that the controlling shareholder of one of them can own the building that the Department of Health rents, while small farmers that produce money go to the wall. Now, he's obviously a better businessman than them. He wouldn't own it otherwise. But we do have to look at the huge imbalance that's taking place. And I just want to mention two things that, in my view, are going to make that worse. Inadvertently, but they are going to make it worse. There's this, what's it called? The geographical area of origin for beef. And they're going to bring in this grass-finished Irish beef. Well, now, if they get it, it's in theory good news, because all beef finished in Ireland will be grass-finished Irish beef, because thankfully, most beef cattle spend most of their lives outdoors. We haven't yet reached a stage, although I think we will, unfortunately. We haven't yet reached a stage where you have cattle who are 24 months old and they've never seen grass under them, or they've never seen the sky over them. Personally, I find that immoral on some level, and I'm a farmer. I produce beef that are produced to be killed and eaten. But I just find it immoral that cattle would never see anything other than a roof over them and concrete under them. I just think it offends me, and I don't know exactly why it offends me, but it does. It just seems to be so contrary to what is natural. And also, I suppose, to what farmers and generations of farmers before me did. But if every animal in Ireland is going to be a grass-finished Irish beef, well then, what is the scope for the producers' groups? Because we were told the producers' groups could come together and they could maybe register like Burn beef or East Clare beef or Mullingar beef, or take your pick, Balnacarrigy beef, and argue and get a geographical area of origin which should be recognised, and maybe argue for a higher price from the ABPs, from the Dawn Meats, from Slaney, from Keepack, from the big players. But now you've taken that from them by applying for this recognition for Ireland. So that, if everybody has it, well, then it becomes worthless. It's kind of like inflation, you inflate away the possibility, the bargaining chips that these have. And the other thing that's recently been feted is ABP's Advantage Beef programme, which sounds great because it's about traceability. It's about ensuring less movement of cattle. It basically means that there'll be a 20-cent bonus for cattle when they're killed on the grid. The grid price will be averaged across all ABP and Slaney plants. I think 7 of them it'll be averaged across them in any event. But the conditions are that the cattle will have to have been on no more than 2 farms during their life. And they have to be at least a year on the farm in which they're killed. Now, that all sounds great for the consumers, but the actual effect of that is to ensure that you can't have cattle who are bought in a mart the year before they're killed. And marts were introduced in the 60s, in the 70s, to ensure some degree of transparency in what was always, I suppose, a slightly murky business, but at least there were multifaceted places the cattle could be killed, and cattle were being brought to Dublin and shipped live to the port of Bristol and elsewhere in the UK at the time. So while there was no transparency in it, there was a greater degree of competition. If you take that out, well, then you're further empowering beef processors to set a price. Because what happens when you don't have enough cattle? When sometimes supply exceeds, or sometimes supply doesn't quite meet demand. And that happened last summer in the Irish beef business. And it was a rare thing and a wonderful thing. And beef prices are good at the moment. I'm not saying they're not, but I'm very much afraid of the power of processors when beef prices take a turn and international beef prices take a turn, their power to use that to ensure that they're insulated from the downturn in the market and ordinary producers get screwed, because that's what they do. So what happens when demand exceeds supply is that processors have to go out there and go to the marts to buy cattle, finished cattle, and they have to pay a market price for it. They actually have to, lo and behold, compete with one another for cattle in the marts. So then farmers realise, oh, they're actually making more per kilo than I thought they were, so I can demand more per kilo. And that's what happened last summer. But if you bring in a scheme, apparently with the backing of the Department of Agriculture, because the Department of Agriculture backs anything that's advantageous to the big producers, the big beef processors, and the big dairy co-ops, to the detriment of small producers who they regard as a nuisance. So if you have a scheme such as the one that's been produced by, or been proposed by ABP, well then you can't go to the marts. So you'll have less trade going through the marts. So you'll have even less transparency in a very non-transparent market. And that, I have to say, worries me, because as I say, this requirement that cattle have to be 6 months, or have to be 12 months on a farm, with the exception, of course, of bull beef, which is only to be 6 months. Now, if there was a rationale for 12 months, well, surely there's a similar rationale for 6 months. But it's actually because you usually, you don't see young bulls traded as much in marts as you would see cows and steers. So it is, I think, to undermine one of the few areas in which we have transparency in the food chain in Ireland. Because we've no transparency between what the beef processors pay, and they buy cattle themselves. We don't know what they pay for them themselves. They're using more and more and more feedlots. And of course, when demand wanes a little bit, when supply wanes a little bit, they're able to empty those feedlots to suppress prices. And we have no transparency around what the retailers pay the processors. We've no transparency around the conditions attached to it, that they be, for example, Angus beef or Hereford beef, or 30 months old, or 33 months old, or 36 months old, or the extent to which consumers want that, or the extent to which it's actually a ploy that the processors have to suppress prices. We've no transparency around any of that. But we do have transparency around what cattle of 450 kilos, 550 kilos, or whatever weight are making in the marts on a given day, on a given week. That's absolutely transparent. And this, to me, is an attempt to undermine that and remove that only little bit of transparency that farmers have. Now, of course, I'm not saying it's justified on other bases, because we'll have less movements and we'll have more certainty, and it'll be all on board be a quality assured herds. But up to now we have board B quality assurance herds that are if you want to finish cattle, they have to have come from an on board be a quality assured herd, unless you're unless you're buying them a long time before they're killed. So I don't really accept the rationale for it, and I question the rationale for it. That said, I mean, I'm not convinced that these are issues that can easily be addressed by way of legislation. I think there's a culture change required in how we produce food, but in how we promote the food we produce and in how we encourage food producers. And the Department of Agriculture, it seems to me, for a long time now, have been corralling producers down one lane, and that's towards greater intensification. Take out, if there's a lake in the middle of your farm, take it out, it's a waste of time. If there's a hedgerow on it, take it out, it's a waste of space. And at the same time, then we have a government which rightly is promoting biodiversity, but we have a Department of Agriculture which inadvertently perhaps is promoting forms of agriculture that are completely detrimental to that. So I think we really do need to take a step back. I don't think that what I've highlighted, or sought to highlight at least, can be addressed by way of anti-competition legislation. It's a political issue, but it is about who holds political sway in the Department of Agriculture. I don't mean which party, but I mean who does the Department of Agriculture? Is it a department for food producers, or is it a department of large-scale multinational beef packers, effectively, and co-ops, who are increasingly moving away from the farmer base that heretofore owned them and controlled them. And I fear that the dairy sector will go the same way as the beef sector has, that they'll become, in a way, controlled by processors rather than controlled by producers. Thank you very much, Gabriela.
Lovely, thank you.